Hi everyone and welcome back. This is part two of week four. We were just talking about Samuel Huntington, and this slide addresses the origins of some of his arguments, which are interesting for us. Huntington was originally someone who was criticizing a category of scholarship that he called the Modernization school. And modernization theory, as we were saying, sort of pertained to this idea that, to put a sort of a spin on it, that all good things go together. This idea that you could have political evolution and economic development going on at the same time. And as we see here on the inset, this is the twofold dilemma of modernization theory: how to transform the newly independent colonial states that we were talking about earlier on into fully developed sovereign nation states. How these two sorts of states would eventually traverse each other. That the colonial states would somehow lose the burden of their lack of culture, of being self-governed. They're kind of in a state of almost like permanent childhood, according to some critics at the time. So you kind of wanted them to become responsible states, modern states with rigorous governmental systems backing them up, bureaucracies, etc. And then how to get these states to develop in a way that was, in keeping with your goals in this regards, but also then to prevent those states from aligning with the Soviet Union down the road. And Huntington's response to modernization theory was that that there wasn't really an obvious pathway wherein previously colonial people, with a lot of their sort of maybe like more traditional backgrounds or more tribal style ways of doing things, there wasn't an obvious way in which those people would become modern like us. That, after all, is something that takes a lot of time it's a transition that takes a lot of time to take effect. People aren't born into being modern Western individuals, and if all they've known all their entire lives is living in a kind of a more tribal or colonial dependent state, then they're not exactly going to have that sort of Western style, and I'm stereotyping here, but then again, this is Huntington's theory, the Western style kind of self-starter, go-getter type attitude that Western consumers tend to have. Western consumers tend to sort of have a kind of a work ethic where they might want certain things for themselves in their material lives, so they set out to acquire those things, and they do that through hard work, and they understand the value of things. They understand the value of a vote. They understand the value of participation in civic life, that kind of thing. And whereas maybe these other people just don't have that culture, they don't have that habit, and it takes a long time for a society to develop that. So this is what Huntington means about differentiation. Obviously, there's in the traditional use of the word differentiation. We use that word to mean differentiating between things. But what a differentiated people, I think that the topic is a little bit different here. We're talking about people who are singularly different from each other. In other words, individualized. So modern societies are individualized societies, and only individualized societies can be modern. If you're living as a group, if you're living more as a tribe or as an ethnicity, and not putting your individual self at the front of this, the way Western Anglo-Protestant societies especially tend to do, then you're not exactly going to be developing very, very quickly into anything that would be sort of recognizable as a modern Western state. So that meant, I guess, from Huntington's point of view, vis-a-vis the Cold War, which was ongoing at the time when he was first putting these ideas out, that they didn't really believe that, he didn't really believe that it was worthwhile trying to develop some of these states. He thought that dictatorships might be a better way to have them governed. And so in a way it became a kind of a justification for the United States to ally itself with some fairly dubious looking dictatorship type countries, all in the hope of defeating the bigger enemy, which was the Soviet Union at the time. So people like Henry Kissinger at the time might have taken a similar view, for example, when they would have said, look, you know, and I think this is a famous phrase of his, he may be a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch. So what does that mean? I mean, you can sort of join the dots, right? I mean, it means that, you know, if these colonial people aren't ready to be evolved into modern Western people yet, well, we got to win this war here. And if we don't maybe make a deal with the dictator here, these people could have a so-called democratic revolution and play themselves right into the hands of some kind of Soviet proxy populist regime, which would be no good for us at all. So I guess what Huntington was really looking for here was an alternative way, an alternative pathway for some of these countries to take up part of the battle of the Cold War and avoid some of the complications of you know, getting into protracted efforts to develop some of these countries. On this slide, we talk a little bit, and I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because it's not the main focus of the lecture. But I just wanted to sort of focus with you on Huntington's critique of modernization. The classic assumptions of modernization theory are these 4 points. Change and development are easy, all good things go together, radical and revolution are bad, and distributing power is more important than accumulating power. Now, none of this is in the textbook, so I don't want you to worry about it too much, okay? But it's an interesting point all the same. Huntington, as you see in the inset quote, had a belief that it's not the absence of modernity but the efforts to achieve it which produce political disorder. If poor countries appear to be unstable, it is not because they are poor but because they are trying to become rich. What does he mean by that? It means that effectively what these countries are trying to do is basically through somewhat slightly maybe socialistic style policies, that they're trying to become rich, they're trying to become equitable. And Samuel Huntington believes that in fact this is a kind of a sort of a social engineering, that it produces upheaval in these more traditional style countries with traditional style politics, and inevitably leads to corruption, which is a vicious cycle because it puts the countries back into the bracket. Now, you can change these countries, but you shouldn't try to change them through these means of trying to create riches are equitable distribution of wealth. So you probably may need to be friendly or on friendlier terms with something more dictatorial as a regime. It might be just better for them. Okay, so Huntington then we can conclude from this, right? Is sort of breaking with point 4 and point 2 of the modernization theory edict. He's saying that economic and political change in point 2 do not go well together. He does agree that radicalism and revolution in the communist style are bad, and that's to be avoided. But you can't buy these people off, right? You can't use distributing wealth or distributing power to help these people, because inevitably that does lead to corruption. So while these people are not politically evolved, there's no point in trying to give them democracy, and that's his point. And in that sense, we can say that, as I say in my notes here, he's a modernization revisionist. He believed, based on what he was seeing in the world, that after all the modernization work that was going on, very few third world countries were actually becoming like us. And so he argued that the modernization theory focused too much on development and not enough on politics, on political realities. So that's why he rejected assumption 2 and assumption 4. And ideally then for Huntington, by producing a world that was more politically ordered, you would actually create a more viable chance at creating kind of a global harmony or a global peace down the road. So how does Huntington get from this theory of his to a theory of the clash of civilizations? Well, we have 3 aspects to investigate here. First of all, how does he define these civilizations? How precisely is world politics mapped into civilizations? And why should we expect civilizations to clash after the Cold War? Well, for his argument, Huntington borrows a metaphor from geology, as you may imagine, with this sort of clash. If you've been reading the homework, there's a kind of a plate tectonics metaphor underlying his argument here. He says that civilizations are kind of like cultural plates lying beneath the surface of global politics. And if you know how earthquakes work, you know there's usually two global tectonic plates rubbing against each other, and there's usually a lot of calm, but there's pressure building up, and over time that pressure has to be relieved, and so the plates will slip by each other, creating earthquakes and perhaps volcanoes as well sometimes, depending on the directions in which they're moving. So we call these fault lines, and he uses that term fault line to describe the civilizational clash that he's interested in. So we have the definition here that he offers of a civilizational entity. It's a cultural identity. He says a civilization is the highest cultural grouping of people and the broadest level of cultural identity people have, short of that which distinguishes humans from other species. So obviously we're all human beings, but we have obviously got fairly distinguishing cultural traits which sort of keep us separate to each other at a cultural level anyway. And he admits that the borders between these phenomena are often fuzzy, but he says they are real and they are genuinely strong historical forces, and they are long lasting. Even if there's a Cold War, he suggests that this can come back later. So what are these cultural groupings? Well, he suggests that you can find them by looking just at how people gather together, often through religious values and associations. So we have the Muslim world is one cultural grouping that he calls a civilization, the Orthodox Christian world, the Western Judeo-Christian world, Latin America, which is Catholic, etc., etc. Now, I think he ultimately identifies about 7 of them, including Japan and Africa, which obviously that's very strange in some ways because it's not clear how some of these civilizations are defined. Some of them seem to be very strongly defined on religious grounds. Others seem to be, he's willing to group in a whole sort of collection of different religions into one, for example, in Africa. And then why is Latin America and the Orthodox Christian world and the Judeo-Christian world all considered separate? Why is the Judeo-Christian world and the Latin American Catholic world not considered part of one civilization? It's hard to know why he would make that distinction. Surely they're the same world, but he's obviously not able to respond to that now. But he says that the fault lines between the civilizations are the battle lines of the future. Now that the Cold War is over, the surface level struggle has been swept away to reveal this deeper, long-running cultural struggle. Huntington concedes that nation-states will remain the most powerful actors in world affairs, but states that the states themselves, while states will remain important as powerful actors, they may not be the principal actors in global affairs in the long run, because these civilizational dynamics capture the politics of the states and direct them to these other ends. Now, if you look at how he breaks that down, he believes that the Judeo-Christian world probably is the most advanced on the planet in terms of its political autonomy, and the fact is other parts of the world, religious values and things like that, tend to creep more into what these people are how these people are interpreting politics. So that is perhaps a key problem for him. Here's just a map that shows you how the civilizations that he has in mind map onto the world map that we have today. And all of these, of course, are legacies of the Roman Empire in the Western world anyway. You can see that very, very clearly. So this map, I think, reveals just how much of a burden Huntington places on the term civilizations. And as I was just saying there, you can see that most of the civilizations are quite clearly religious groupings, but Some aren't, and like Africa, for example, is one such area. It's not clear why that is a civilization. It could be arguably defined as a multitude of civilizations. Why is Latin America and Russia not part of the Western civilization? We were arguing that. And then, you know, why does Japan, if you see Japan there, it's in red, why does that get its own civilization? Why is it so different from the rest of the Asiatic countries? It's not clear. So that's just to talk about Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis and how it's related to his older work. It's this sense, I think, of Huntington's that people from these former colonial states don't have a fully autonomous political system, that their values are swept up and moved along, captured, if you will, by religious affiliations, by tribal affiliations, that we just don't have in the Western world, because we have managed to separate our value system from our political system to a certain extent, although that doesn't make much sense. Maybe should we say religious value system from our political system to a certain extent. And so because of that, we cannot expect peace between the different civilizations. I think that's the most important point. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we see two people here, two faces, and I want to tell you their names. On the left, we have Fukuyama, and on the right, we have Edward Said. Now, Fukuyama is or Francis Fukuyama was George Bush Sr.'s national security advisor, and he made a big name for himself, a big splash, with a very well-known book around about the same time that Samuel Huntington's book came out in 91. And Fukuyama always basically rejected the argument that that there was a clash of civilizations. He believed that basically with the fall of the Berlin Wall, what that basically meant was that we had arrived at a point in time where peoples of the world were going to be finally free. That the downfall of communism meant that it was basically just a matter of running down the clock, and that very, very soon the entire world would come to look like the Western world, because of the basic demand that every single human being had, not as a member of a civilization, but as a member of this global community called the culture of global community of human beings, that everybody would desire the same recognition from everyone else as an equal. So one thing that I guess is important to ask about Fukuyama's thesis vis-a-vis Huntington's is what happens after 9/11. Obviously, the world looks a little bit more like Fukuyama's thesis before 9/11, because obviously we have the heyday of globalization during Bill Clinton and Bush Sr. But after 9/11, it certainly starts to look a little bit more like that Fukuyama's wrong and Huntington might be right. After 9/11, many asked if hopeful liberals like Fukuyama had overstated their case, overstated their optimism for a sort of a shiny, happy, globalized world after 9/11. Why hadn't they imagined the possibility of suicide bombers and the seductive power of martyrdom? And it was tempting for many people to adopt the sort of cape of the clash of civilizations. A lot of people jumped on board with it. Former Clinton administration Secretary of State James Rubin said, in fact, that there was a clash of civilizations. However, on the right-hand side here, we have Edward Said, who is mentioned in your readings for this week. And Said said that, in his opinion, it wasn't so much a clash of civilizations, but a clash of ignorance. And I guess that takes some explaining. A clash of ignorance in the sense that, from Edward Said's point of view, the Orientalists, and we talked about Orientalism earlier on, these are the people that tend to sort of make these vast generalizations about the entire Islamic world. And what made Edward Said angry, I guess, was to look at Huntington and to look at other people like him, like Bernard Lewis, who seemed to be making these huge generalizations about the Muslim world and asking questions like, well, what's wrong with the Muslim world that this would have happened, i.e. 9/11? Whereas also, on the other hand, I think Said was of the mind that the bombers didn't really know that much about the Western world either, and its potential for change, the fact that there was a lot of difference inside the Western world, and potential for tolerance too. So from Said's point of view, and he was a Palestinian intellectual but raised in the Western world, I believe I'm correct in that, he argued that this clash of ignorance term might be better. Even President Bush Jr. argued that it was inappropriate, actually, to speak of a clash of civilizations. He said that certainly one could say that individual human beings, were civilized or uncivilized, but he argued that it was inappropriate to apply this term to entire civilizations. So obviously Bush there, in a sense, sounding a bit more like Edward Said. I wanted to talk to you about this slide a little bit, and we're nearing the end of our lecture, but this is a very important portrait. And we talk about artwork sometimes. I wanted to use this moment, though, to show you this bit of artwork because it captures aspects of Edward Said's theory of Orientalism, which, as we know, is a critique and a response to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. What Said is saying is that by calling the entire Islamic world a civilization, you're tending to reduce disorder and difference within that so-called civilization. You're trying to basically lump it all in together as one thing that can be reduced to a common characterization or set of characterizations. But is it true? For Said, there's a need to examine precisely why differences make us unable to live beside each other. These convenient differences that Samuel Huntington is trying to draw on. Edward Said doesn't really believe that they're so different after all, or that these differences can be applied so universally, that there's probably a lot of differences within our own civilization and a lot of differences within theirs as well. The importance of this painting is that it shows just how the history of the scenario of the clashes of civilizations are forgotten by Huntington. Just as all the other neat and tidy theories we have looked at so far in this semester have been shown to have specificities when you look at them again in a critical light, i.e. the phrenologists, the prisoner's dilemma, the ticking time bomb, so too do we see in this scenario that there's a tendency to engage in scenario-style thinking, or images of thought as we've called them before. Here we have an image that of the Muslim that pops up in Western discourse quite a lot, and it's something that ultimately I think Said is eager to have us understand, that we tend to look at the Muslim world through our own long-developed historical lens. That we have been given by people like the Orientalists, these so-called academics and scholars whose job it is to describe to us the Orient, the Western world, the Eastern world, excuse me. And what this painting shows is that for a long time Muslims have been represented as exotic, overly sensualized, lazy or violent as opposed to rational, orderly and hardworking, all characteristics supposedly of Western modernity. And that's from page 116 in your chapter by Mandeville. It's a great quote because I think it summarizes precisely the problem, that there's a kind of a masculine-feminine dichotomy at stake here, or at play here. For the Western world, it's all too easy to rely on these old discourses, much the same as we mentioned before, that many people who were disagreeing with the possibility of women being admitted into political life would have, for example, cited Aristotle's comment that women were broken men. Similarly here, we find that by drawing on the discourse of Orientalism, Western policymakers have had to think about not just how they're dealing with people, but how they were dealing with these very sensual, exotic, lazy, irrational types. So there's a very similar move going on in both discourses there. On the one hand to do with gender, on the other hand to do with religion and civilization or culture. So the question is, are these discourses true? They may be very powerful, they may have achieved a certain cultural power, but are they actually true? And I think Said's argument is that, in fact, they're not true, but nevertheless they have achieved a certain truth. That is to say, they've achieved a certain power as truth. And when you look at the casual ability of Huntington to lump all of the Islamic civilization into one, or you look at other scholars who around the same time were writing much the same thing, such as Bernard Lewis, you find that they're very, very, casually drawing on these kinds of notions of the childlike nature, the irrational nature of the other, the person who's different to me, in this case the Muslims. On the next slide then, we just have a quick comment on a book by Tariq Ali, who wrote on the clash of fundamentalisms, and you can see here in his humorous book cover an effort to kind of juxtapose these two phenomena, which Edward Said I think was calling the clash of ignorance. So one of the comments that sort of comes from Mandeville towards the end of that chapter was the possibility of, what can we deduce from religion? What influence does religion have in world politics? For Mandeville, I think what he's suggesting is that there are other socioeconomic factors that do come into play, that you can't simply say a clash of religious fundamentalisms or a clash of ideologies in a religious sense, a clash of civilizations, because it's just not detailed enough. It doesn't tell us much about what's going on in the world. It doesn't tell us why there's long periods of peace between religious cultures and where these sometimes flashpoints come from. We've talked before a little bit about Yugoslavia, and we've talked about how economic conditions there led to, and specific political conditions there led to the possibility of a kind of a conflict between peoples who hadn't had much conflict between them in the past. In the 50 years of Yugoslavia, there wasn't much conflict between Serbs and Croats, but suddenly at the end of the Cold War there was. Well, Mandeville, I think, would like us to think about things like that. He argues here, in many cases, the views and motivations of people in the so-called Muslim world can just as easily, if not more accurately, be understood in relation to the problems and concerns of the third world of developing world identities. So, obviously, bringing in here the fact that these aren't just any old countries, these are third world countries, often. That is, in relation to issues of global inequality in socioeconomic terms and politically in terms of the asymmetry of power between countries in the global north and the global south. And I think that's probably there's probably a lot of merit to that argument if we're looking for a true understanding of why these clashes happen. Certainly, I think it reveals a lot about the war on terror. I think the classic case in point in more recent history was in 2006 in Paris, where in Paris, and I know more recently, of course, I think we've had tensions in Britain as well, but I'll focus on the French example for now. The so-called Muslim protesters or North African protesters who took to the streets and started burning cars, the famous period of a couple of weeks where cars were being set on fire in cities all across France for a number of weeks. France has a very large percentage of Algerians living there, and Moroccans and various other countries, but mostly Algerians. What was interesting was how that protest was characterized as a Muslim protest as opposed to a protest by poor people who happened to be Muslim and who were expressing their frustration through the means of their cultural means, through their cultural capacities. The Pew Global Attitudes Project of 2005, which I think is important for us here, does note that the vast majority of Muslims are committed to a reading of Islam that is essentially peaceful, compassionate, and democratic. That's a really important point. The vast majority of Muslims on the planet do not have sympathetic feelings towards jihadis, or anything of the sort. So a lot of these characterizations by Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington, or the French government during the time of these Paris riots, really are drawing on quite incorrect understandings of what motivates Muslims in the Western world and elsewhere. And I think if Edward Said were still alive today, he would be writing about some of these things. He would be very anxious to remind us that not all Muslims are the same everywhere, and certainly those that do protest often are protesting or even carrying out acts of violence, not just because they are Muslim, but because they have other agendas as well. And some of those are not entirely illegitimate. Now, of course, vis-a-vis 9/11, that's the real trick, isn't it? Like, can you make that argument about 9/11? Because as everyone knows, the gentlemen who flew those planes into those buildings were actually quite wealthy. They were from wealthy backgrounds, and they were not from the Arab street. They were not from the slums. So that's something we do have to keep in mind. Obviously, sometimes these things will happen, but I think the key thing Edward Said would want to ask is, why do you want to read 9/11 in that case, and the actions of these men who were clearly motivated by a very extreme interpretation of their religion? Why do you want to read that back into the entire Muslim world and say that it's somehow a clash with the Muslim world, or indeed that most of the tension with the Muslim world is necessarily with people like that? There's a lot of different types of aspects to this, a lot of different facets to it, and I think the important point is to, as Mandeville argues on page 119, the important point is to recognize the lived experience of these people, and not to try to be sympathetic with that, and not to necessarily try to sort of lump them all together as evildoers or that kind of a thing.